The storm had risen fast, swallowing the trail before I realized how far I'd wandered. Rain slid down the hood of my jacket in blind sheets, turning the world into a single, shivering blur. I kept walking because stopping felt worse, like the storm might close its teeth if I hesitated. The shape of the church appeared only when lightning peeled the sky open. A crooked silhouette. A tower with its top missing. A graveyard slumped around it like a forgotten warning. It wasn't where I meant to go, but the wind herded me toward it, and I obeyed. For a moment, the place felt almost merciful. Just stone, weeds, and broken fences, quiet beneath the storm's roar. But the quiet had an edge, a stillness that didn't match the weather, as if the graveyard held its breath the moment I stepped inside. I noticed the tower's clock through the curtains of rain. Its face was cracked and blackened with age, but the hands were clear enough. They pointed to 3:17, frozen, cleanly, unnaturally. The wind howled through the tower's hollow crown, yet the hands refused to tremble. Moving deeper between the headstones, I tried to tell myself I was only looking for shelter. The mud sucked at my boots, but some patches of earth seemed untouched, smooth despite the storm. The rain dimmed the edges of the cemetery into shifting darkness, as if the borders kept sliding away from me. The silence thickened the farther I went. Even the storm felt muted here, like sound died before it reached the ground. I paused, listening, nothing. No branches rattling, no thunder rolling across the hills, no wind threading through the stones. Just my breath and the quiet pressing against it. Then, without warning, thunder cracked, close, impossibly close, shaking the earth under my feet. It didn't echo across the sky. It came from the direction of the tower, not above it. The storm seemed to settle into my bones as I moved toward the tower's base, each step heavier than the last, as if the ground wanted me to feel its weight. The graveyard stretched in uneven rows, some stones crumbling inward, others leaning like weary shoulders. But one plot stopped me cold. A grave lying directly in the shadow of the tower, glaringly clean while every other surface drowned in mud. Its edges were sharp, almost surgical, as though carved just moments before the storm broke. I told myself it only looked bright because the lightning kept catching it at the right angle, but the thought didn't hold long. The rain hammered the earth hard enough to drown footprints. Yet this grave remained untouched, immaculate, too deliberate to be an accident. When lightning split the sky again, symbols crawled across the tombstone in a pattern I couldn't place. Neither words nor drawings. More like the marks someone might scratch into stone while shaking. Each line a slanted, unnatural curve that refused to settle into meaning. They seemed to pulse when the light hit them, and even after the flash faded, I felt their shapes still burning behind my eyes. I stepped closer, not sure why, maybe to prove it was real, maybe because some part of me felt watched and needed to confront the watching thing directly. The moment my boot sank into the softened soil beside the grave, the earth trembled. Not enough to knock me off balance, but enough that my teeth clicked together. The tremor wasn't from the thunder overhead. It rolled upward, through the dirt, as if something below shifted its weight in answer to mine. I held still, breath hitching, rain dripping from my hood in a slow rhythm that didn't match the pulse rising under the soil. The storm grumbled, but the ground's movement followed its own timing, a separate conversation happening beneath my feet. I stepped back, heart pounding, and when I did, the tremor softened into stillness, like whatever lay below had retreated. I wanted to turn away, to look toward the gate, the path. Any direction that wasn't this one, but something in the air changed, a heaviness settling behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, just to reassure myself the grave was still where it belonged, but the breath caught in my throat. It was closer than before. Not by much, only a foot or two, as if the lines of the cemetery had subtly rearranged themselves while I blinked. The tower loomed behind it, unchanged, but the grave had shifted, tilted slightly, its shadow merging with the towers as if seeking refuge. I wiped my eyes, blaming the rain, the darkness, fatigue, anything rational, but the truth pressed harder with each second. It hadn't been there when I first entered the yard, and it certainly hadn't sat this close to me. A cold ripple crawled up my spine as the storm groaned overhead, and for the first time since seeking shelter, I realized I wasn't lost in the graveyard. I was being positioned within it. The forest's wind died suddenly, as if the storm itself had paused to watch me, leaving the rain to drip from leaves in hollow, irregular taps that echoed in the unnatural quiet. Every sound I thought I heard before, the whistle of wind through broken branches, the patter of rain against stone, vanished, leaving only the crunch of my boots in the mud and my own uneven breathing, loud enough to make me jump. Then I noticed it, a faint, rhythmic ticking, slow and deliberate, so soft that at first I thought it was my pulse echoing in my skull, but the sound didn't match my heartbeat. It came from beneath the grave, that impossible, immaculate plot under the clock tower, the one that had shifted closer the night before. I froze, ears straining, and the ticking rose in volume, not just beneath my feet but seeming to thrum through the soil itself, through the soles of my boots, into my ribs. The clock above had not moved in decades, but the sound synchronized perfectly with my panic, and with every tick, the ground seemed to lean subtly under me, like the earth was aware of my weight and adjusting to it. My gaze flicked from one headstone to another, and in that half-light, half-rain, every marker bent just slightly, as if inching toward me in slow, patient hunger. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, exhaustion, the storm playing tricks, but the ticking skipped once. Sharp, staccato, a hollow note that vibrated up through my teeth, and my stomach dropped. Every stone around me shivered in response, minute movements I couldn't have noticed if my life hadn't felt suspended in that instant. My breath fogged in the cold, and the windlessness made each exhale cling to my face, heavy and wet. I moved back a step, then another, trying to escape the subtle pull, but the ticking followed, or maybe I was following it, unthinking, drawn toward the grave as if by a magnetic force beneath the earth. The rain blurred my vision, but even through the curtain of water I could see the shapes of shadows stretching and folding, reacting not to the storm but to the pulses beneath the ground. My heart pounded, the sound no longer separate from the ticking but merging into it, a grotesque duet. And then, for a moment, the grave seemed to breathe, soil swelling and sinking imperceptibly, tiny fissures appearing in the otherwise perfect surface, and I realized with a clarity that cut through the panic that I was standing on something alive, or something pretending to be. I wanted to run, to leap toward the forest's edge, but the ticking anchored me, every bone tightening in slow horror, and I knew that however I moved, however far I thought I went, the earth beneath me was counting, and I was in its rhythm. I tried to leave the cemetery, moving with deliberate steps toward what I thought was the gate, but the rain and thickening fog tangled the world into a shape that made no sense. Each path I chose curved subtly, bending around headstones and leaning trees until I found myself back at the same grave beneath the tower, the rain slicking my boots and turning mud into a futile trap. I stepped away again, faster this time, and the earth conspired the same way. No matter the direction, no matter how I counted the stones, the lines of the cemetery folded like a twisted map, each attempt looping me back to the immaculate grave that had never belonged there. Lightning cut across the sky, briefly illuminating the symbols etched into the tombstone. Sharper now, like fresh cuts in wet stone, as if the storm itself was carving them deeper while I wasn't watching. I bent closer, trying to make sense of the language that refused to exist, the curves and angles writhing in my mind, and the faint ticking that had begun beneath the ground returned, lower now, a muted thud in time with my heartbeat, echoing through the soles of my boots like some monstrous pulse that waited under the soil. My limbs shook, not from cold, not from exhaustion, but from the insistence of the ground beneath me, as if it had grown impatient with my attempts at escape. I ran in short bursts, turning corners that led nowhere, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and something metallic I could not name, a tang of iron that clung to my nose and throat, and every time I slowed, the muted heartbeat beneath me grew louder, more deliberate, syncing perfectly with the panic in my chest. I tried to force my mind to reason, to remember the layout of the cemetery, the broken fences, the leaning stones, but the world refused. The rain blurred everything. The fog swallowed distances, and even the tower seemed to move imperceptibly in my periphery, always just out of reach, always keeping the grave beneath its shadow at the center of my vision. My breaths came ragged, misting in front of my face, and the quiet between the thunder felt like waiting, an expectation that something would rise to meet me. Each loop of the path reinforced the certainty that I was not wandering randomly. The cemetery was aware, active, and the symbols on the tombstone were a warning I could not read. I wanted to stop, to close my eyes and pray that the ground would release me, but the heartbeat beneath my boots refused, a relentless drum that grew louder with each failed attempt, reminding me that however far I thought I went, however fast I tried to flee, the paths were no longer mine to choose. The storm did not drive me anymore. The cemetery did. Lightning flashed through the church windows, brief and jagged, and in that instant the tower's shadow unfurled across the cemetery like a living thing, stretching toward the immaculate grave beneath it, long and deliberate, dark as spilled ink, and I felt the shift in the air before I even noticed it. The shadows weren't following the storm. They were aware, moving in response to me, bending and stretching with a precision that made my stomach drop. I stepped back, heart hammering, boots sinking into mud that now seemed unwilling to hold me, and a shape rose beside the tombstone, impossibly thin, elongated beyond any human proportions, its form flickering in the half-light as if the rain itself could not touch it. It didn't speak, didn't move toward me in a normal sense, but its presence was a pressure that pressed against my chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe. I tried to blink it away, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, of fatigue, of the storm, but my pulse was caught in time with the faint thud beneath the grave, now a muted echo that aligned with the creeping stretch of the shadows. The clock tower's hands twitched once, a shiver in the frozen 317, and the shadows froze with them, rigid and unnatural, as though caught mid-motion, watching, waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the paths I had tried before bent back toward the grave, toward the tower, and the ground beneath my feet seemed subtly aware of every movement, guiding me without my consent. Rain sluiced down my neck, dripped into my eyes, but the wetness could not wash away the certainty that whatever I faced was not just a specter of weather or memory. It was deliberate, conscious, tethered to the tower and the grave alike. I could feel its focus, a gaze that did not need eyes, pressing into me from the soil and the air. And when lightning struck again, the tall, thin shape flickered, rising momentarily above the mud, then sank back as though the earth itself had swallowed it. I swallowed hard, the taste of iron in my mouth, and realized with a sickening clarity that the grave had anchored something, had been waiting, and the shadows were its tendrils, probing outward in response to my presence. The rain thundered, the wind shrieked through the trees, and still the clock's hands remained at 3:17, shivering once and then still, leaving the shadows frozen in the air like ink on glass. I took a step backward, only to feel the ground pulse beneath me, a heartbeat beneath my boots, and I understood I was not outside this horror. I was inside it, enclosed by shadows that knew my shape, my weight, my fear, and I could not find a path that did not lead me back to the tower, to the grave, to the unrelenting gaze beneath the storm. Midnight approached, though my watch refused to settle on any single hour, flickering between times like the storm was mocking me, and every glance at it made the seconds feel heavier, as if time itself had grown viscous and slow. The ground beneath the grave thrummed again, a deep, piercing hum that vibrated through my ribs and settled into my chest like some living organ pressing from below. And I realized the sound carried more than vibration. It carried my name, stretched long and low, hidden inside the resonance, drawn out in a way that made my tongue clench and my throat tighten. I staggered, boots slipping in the mud, each step sinking painfully with the hum, each pulse of sound a reminder that I was not walking in empty earth, but over something deliberate, aware, alive. The storm had halted in abrupt obedience. Rain no longer fell, wind no longer shrieked, and the silence left the ticking beneath the grave louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound was inside me now, in the bones and blood, and when the strike came, 12 silent blows in my mind. It was not a clock in the tower, not a bell hung above, but a rhythm that claimed me entirely. Each strike echoed without echo, resonating through my skull and torso, stretching the world into a slow-motion nightmare where each second dragged on forever. I wanted to run, to flee into the forest, to sink into the mud and hide from the invisible mechanism counting me down, but I could not. My limbs obeyed an instinct that was no longer mine, pacing, twisting, recoiling, and still the hum vibrated, filling the space where my own voice should have been. My pulse raced, tangled with the subterranean heartbeat, and the grave seemed to respond, its edges quivering subtly, shifting imperceptibly, as if it were inhaling and exhaling under the soil, and I realized that the tower, the grave, the shadows, and the earth were all waiting for this moment. The silent strike of midnight that demanded attention without sound. Time fractured. I glimpsed the tower in a lightning flash, its hands unmoving yet shivering as though acknowledging the strike, and the world outside the graveyard had vanished, leaving only this place, this pulsing, listening earth. I could feel a presence behind my eyes, inside my thoughts, aligning my terror with its rhythm, and when the final, invisible strike landed, the storm ended entirely, the sudden absence of noise pressing so hard it felt like windless suffocation. Everything stopped, and in that perfect silence, I understood that I had not survived the strike. I had been measured, counted, noted, and the grave beneath the tower waited for what came next, patient, unblinking, eternal. I bolted through the warped doors of the church, slamming them behind me, the wood groaning and shaking as though it resented being closed, and the sudden stillness inside made my ears ache after the storm's fury. The air smelled of wet stone and rotting wood, with a faint tang of iron that reminded me of the graveyard outside, as if the earth had followed me in. The pews sat empty, coated in moonlit dust that caught the occasional flash of lightning filtering through the cracked windows, and water dripped steadily in a straight line across the floor, pooling in dark, cold circles that led my eyes toward the altar. I thought the drip might be rain seeping through the roof, but its rhythm was too deliberate, too measured, each drop echoing with the finality of a heartbeat, and my boots splashed softly in the shallow puddles as I moved closer. Through the broken glass, I saw the grave outside glow faintly, a soft, unnatural light emanating from the soil itself, illuminating the symbols carved into the stone that burned in my memory, as though etched into the world, not merely into stone. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and wrong, moving against the grain of the moonlight. Yet, when I turned, nothing stood between me and the door I had just slammed. The air thickened with the smell of dampness, and something older, something metallic, and I realized the silence inside was heavier than the storm, almost listening, waiting. My pulse quickened, matching the faint thrum beneath the earth that I had felt outside, and I understood that whatever I had fled, whatever had anchored itself to the grave, was aware of me here, aware of every step, every breath. I edged toward the altar, compelled despite the dread, watching the shadows pool and shift, as if they had lives of their own, separate from the failing light of the moon. The church felt alive, hollow, yet watching. A vessel for something unseen that had slipped past the walls of the tower and the soil, lingering now where I should have been safe. Each drop of water that fell onto the floor echoed, in the cavernous space, tiny hammers marking seconds, and I could feel the grave's pulse through the ground, faint yet insistent, pulling me toward a realization I could not name. I wanted to flee back outside, but the door seemed farther than it had moments ago. The distance warped, and the glow of the tombstone beckoned, almost hypnotic in its unnatural calm. A shiver crawled up my spine as the shadow crossed the floor again. Slow, deliberate, impossible, yet no figure accompanied it. And in that instant, trapped between dripping water, moonlit dust, and the silent, glowing grave, I understood that the church was not refuge. It was another stage, another part of whatever had been waiting, patient beneath the storm, beneath the earth, beneath me. The dim gray of morning rose over the cemetery, but it brought no relief, only a thin, pallid light that washed the world in silence, revealing mud-slicked stones and waterlogged earth in sharp, cold detail. The humming beneath the grave that had haunted the night was gone, leaving an emptiness in my chest that felt heavier than the storm's roar had been. The glowing light from the tombstone faded slowly, retreating into the soil, leaving the grave ordinary again, though its edges were burned into memory, sharp and impossible to forget. I traced footprints from the church door, wet and smeared in the mud, leading toward the clock tower, and followed them with a sense of dread that made my stomach knot. They disappeared into puddles, vanishing as though the earth had swallowed every mark of passage. My mind tried to reconcile what I had seen, the impossible shifts of ground, the shadows that moved with awareness, the hollow pulse beneath my boots. But the dawn offered no answers, only clarity that terror does not dissolve with light. When the locals spoke later, insisting no grave had ever existed beneath the tower, I felt a flicker of madness press against the edges of reason, because I had stood there, had seen the soil glow, and the symbols burn in the mud as if etched by fire. Yet no record remained, nothing to show for the night except fear itself. The burned patterns in the soil lingered, faint and scorched, a cruel echo of what should not have been. And every time I tried to speak of it, the memory felt slippery, the edges of reality bending like the paths that had trapped me, looping me back over and over to the same place. The clock's hands moved once, a single, deliberate tick, and for a moment, the silence of the morning shivered in response, but there was no comfort in the motion, no promise of safety. The terror of the night had not ended. It had merely receded to the margins, waiting, patient, like a shadow at the corner of vision. The mud glistened in faint sunlight. The puddles reflected a pale sky, and still, I could feel the pulse beneath the earth, faint but insistent, as though counting, marking, recording every step I had taken, every breath I had drawn. I understood then that dawn did not save anyone, that the tower and the grave and the soil itself had their own time, their own reckoning, and I was merely an intruder, a witness to something older and deliberate, a horror that outlasted storms, shadows, and mortal fear. And even as I left the cemetery, boots sinking in the wet earth, every instinct screamed that I had not truly escaped, that what had measured me beneath the storm, beneath the grave, beneath the shadows, was still there, waiting for the next cycle, patient and eternal, as the clock's hands settled finally at 3:18, and I knew the night would return. The cemetery stretched out before him like a frozen ocean, pale moonlight catching the edges of crumbling gravestones and weathered statues. He had come expecting history, shadows, maybe the quiet stir of nocturnal animals, nothing more. The rumors had been persistent. Whispers among the locals about crypts that delved far deeper than the records suggested. Some said the corridors went on for miles beneath the earth, shifting in ways that made maps useless, swallowing anyone who ventured too far. Curiosity, professional rigor, and a hint of recklessness led him to the wrought iron gates that creaked softly in the night wind. As he passed through, the air changed. It grew colder, thicker, and stiller. The scent of damp stone hit first, an earthy metallic tang that settled in the back of his throat. He drew a deep breath, but it did little to clear the heaviness pressing in from all sides. The paths beneath his boots were uneven, gravel crunching in hollow echoes that seemed too long, lingering as though someone, or something, was walking just behind him. Shadows clung to every corner, deepening as the moonlight skimmed over cracked tombstones. Even familiar monuments, ones he had photographed before, seemed elongated, slightly off, as though they were breathing in the dark. The entrance to the crypt was set against a hill, hidden among leaning stones and skeletal trees. A narrow stairway descended into the blackness below, the stone slick with condensation, each step cold enough to seep through his boots. He paused at the edge, listening, but only the faint echo of dripping water reached him. Yet the air felt alive, and for a moment he could swear he heard something else, a low murmur, almost like breath, brushing against the walls behind him. It was indecipherable, a language he couldn't place, yet it carried weight, a presence that clung just beyond perception. With careful steps, he began the descent. Each stone groaned under his weight, a resonant sound that traveled up the narrow stairwell. The temperature plummeted as he went deeper, his breath fogged in short, shallow clouds. He gripped the rough stone walls, feeling the cold seep into his fingertips. The echoes followed him, bouncing off unseen corners in patterns he could not predict. Somewhere beneath him, the crypt seemed to hum, subtle vibrations that prickled the base of his skull. The passage widened into a hall, vaulted and dimly lit by the faint glow of phosphorescent moss clinging to the damp stone. Shadows pooled in every corner, bending unnaturally, folding over surfaces that should have been flat. Faint scratching noises echoed somewhere deeper, too soft to locate, like fingernails tracing the stone. And then came the whispers, so quiet at first that he thought the sound might be the wind traveling through cracks. But they persisted, intangible syllables slipping past comprehension, brushing against his mind, brushing just behind his ears, lingering in ways no echo could account for. He tried to steady himself, chalking it up to nerves, to expectation, to fatigue. The crypts were said to mess with perception, with time. Perhaps that was all this was, a trick of imagination amplified by the cold and the damp. Yet the air was oppressive, heavier than it had any right to be, and the shadows pressed against the edges of his vision. Something about the scale of the crypts felt impossible. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, every turn revealing yet another corridor, identical yet subtly wrong. A shiver ran down his spine as he moved forward. The faint echoes, the whispers, the impossible breadth of stone around him began to erode certainty. The crypts were already larger than he could understand, a labyrinth without beginning or end. Each step brought him deeper into the unknown, the shadows more possessive, the air colder, denser. The faint murmurings that had brushed past his ears grew bolder, teasing comprehension without giving clarity, hinting that the walls themselves were aware of him, aware of every careful, hesitant footfall. He paused again, inhaling the damp, metallic scent, and tried to convince himself it was simply stone, mold, and fear playing tricks. But even as he told himself this, the darkness around him seemed to lean in closer, swallowing the lantern's glow, curling at the edges of vision, stretching down corridors that should have ended. The crypt was alive in some way he could not define, and he was already inside it, caught in the slow pull of its cold, endless stone. Each step forward carried a weight he could not see, a presence that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. And as he descended into the next hall, deeper and colder, he realized the whispers were no longer at the edge of perception. They were following him. Somewhere ahead, or perhaps all around, the crypt was watching, waiting, and already shaping the world to itself. As he moved deeper into the crypts, the walls seemed to breathe, stretching and narrowing in ways that defied logic, and shadows clung to corners just beyond the reach of his lantern. Vaults appeared in his peripheral vision, solid and ancient one moment, and then vanished when he turned to look directly, leaving only empty space where stone should have been. The air grew colder still, damp and metallic, carrying faint whispers that he could not place, indecipherable murmurs echoing off walls that seemed to curve and warp in impossible angles. Scratches echoed from empty chambers, soft but deliberate, as if fingernails traced the surfaces from within, following him, guiding him, or perhaps warning him. He pressed on, compelled by curiosity and a growing unease, feeling the weight of something unseen watching his every move. Every corridor he passed shifted subtly. The floor sloped in ways his mind could not reconcile. Vaults that had been there moments before, now nowhere to be found, replaced by walls that seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, hinting at spaces that should not exist. He paused, lantern held high, and realized he could no longer trust his own eyes. The crypts were manipulating him, guiding him through a labyrinth that bent around his perception, shaping paths to confuse, disorient, and ensnare. The whispers grew bolder, no longer just background noise, now forming faint syllables that almost took shape. Half-words, fragments of names and places he thought he recognized but could not fully recall. Each step was mirrored by a subtle vibration through the stone beneath his feet, a resonance that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle and his stomach tighten. Shadows shifted along the walls, flickering at the edge of vision, forming angles that hinted at shapes he knew, faces that seemed familiar, yet vanished the instant he focused. The vaults themselves became a puzzle, appearing and disappearing with a rhythm that mocked him, drawing him toward spaces that may not have been real, leading him deeper into corridors that reflected his own hesitation and fear. He began to suspect that the crypts were not simply structures of stone, but living entities, aware of his presence, aware of his curiosity, subtly guiding and testing him. Every attempt to retrace his steps was met with impossible geometry. A wall he passed moments ago now blocked the way, or an archway shifted to lead him somewhere he had not yet seen. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something older, almost iron-like, that burned faintly in his nostrils. His lantern flickered against the walls, revealing shapes that disappeared when he blinked, faint echoes of movement that could not be human. With each passing moment he felt the crypt's presence pressing closer, a subtle, omnipresent awareness that made him hyper-conscious of every heartbeat, every step, every breath fogging in the frigid air. And as he turned yet again into a corridor that should have been familiar but was anything but, he understood a chilling truth. The vaults were not simply disappearing. They were alive in some way, shifting around him, shaping themselves to his fears, feeding on his attention, and guiding him deeper into a labyrinth from which there might be no return, leaving him unsettled, disoriented, and painfully aware that he had already become a part of the crypt's mysterious, ever-changing architecture. He turned a corner into a narrower passage, and there, tucked into a shadowed alcove, he discovered a vault unlike the others, its door slightly ajar, revealing flickers of candlelight that had no visible flame. Inside, the air smelled warmer, almost perfumed with smoke and wax, a sharp contrast to the damp stone of the surrounding crypts. On the floor and atop a low pedestal were artifacts that seemed impossibly recent, letters folded with care, photographs of people whose faces he did not recognize, and small, melted candles that looked like they had only just been extinguished. Every object radiated an unsettling presence, as though each had been left specifically for him to find. When he reached out, the air seemed to vibrate under his fingertips, and the faintest whisper slipped through the stone walls, almost conversational, hinting at lives entwined with the crypts, people who had disappeared or perhaps never existed, yet whose traces lingered insistently. He stepped deeper inside, trying to examine the letters, but the words blurred, then sharpened, then changed as if the ink itself were alive, responding to his gaze. The corridor outside no longer followed the rules of memory. It had begun to rearrange itself, folding and twisting in patterns that mirrored his own fears and the faint recollections of past mistakes, the hallways reflecting the architecture of his own mind. Time, too, seemed to fracture. He could no longer tell if he had been standing in the vault for seconds or hours, each breath feeling elongated, stretched thin by the oppressive presence that now hung over him. Shadows flickered along the walls, forming vague shapes of faces he thought he had forgotten. Friends, family, strangers, smiling, watching, judging, vanishing the instant he tried to focus. The whispers multiplied, layering atop each other, murmuring names and half-sentences, recounting events he had long buried, hinting that the crypts remembered more than he had ever shared, as if the stone walls themselves were sentient, sifting through the minutiae of his life. He tried to step back, to leave the vault behind, but the passage had shifted. The corridor he had entered through had vanished, replaced by a mirrored hallway that reflected his own exhaustion and confusion, amplifying the sense that he was walking through a living, breathing puzzle. Every artifact seemed to pulse subtly in response to his presence, casting shadows that danced across walls in ways that contradicted the lantern's glow, the candlelight shifting angles that defied logic, creating new perspectives and opening spaces that should not exist. A faint metallic tang rose in the air, mingling with the scent of wax and damp stone, making his stomach churn. And with each step he took, he became increasingly aware that the crypts were observing him, testing him, feeding on his perception of reality. The photographs seemed to move when unobserved, the letters hinted at actions, yet to be taken, and the faint whispers now threaded directly into his thoughts, suggesting a familiarity, an intimacy that unsettled him beyond reason. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that the vaults were more than architecture. They were vessels for memory, for the living and the dead, intertwined in ways he could not parse, each corridor, each artifact, each whisper reshaping themselves to draw him further into the crypt's labyrinthine memory, making escape, if it ever had existed, seem impossibly distant. The corridors twisted around him, folding in on themselves like the crypts were breathing, reshaping with a deliberate patience that made his head spin. Every turn he took led to spaces he thought he had passed before, yet each repetition carried subtle differences, shadows that lingered longer, walls that slanted at impossible angles, inscriptions that shifted slightly, as if mocking his attempts to map the place in his mind. Footsteps echoed in the distance, faint and untraceable, sometimes just behind him, sometimes ahead, always impossible to locate, and each echo seemed to mimic his own pace, creating a disorienting loop that made him question the rhythm of his own steps. Shadows flickered along the walls, forming vague shapes that tugged at the edges of recognition. Faces, postures, gestures from his own past. Moments he thought long buried. A childhood memory, a lost friend, a face he had seen only once. All seemed to stretch across the stone, taunting him, testing whether he would acknowledge them or continue blindly forward. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, wax, and something faintly metallic, almost like blood, that had no clear origin, mingling to make his stomach churn. The whispers had multiplied again, layering atop each other in a dense hum that invaded his thoughts, murmuring fragments of events, names, and emotions that he knew, but could not place in sequence, feeding on the disorientation, threading the crypt's awareness directly into his mind. He reached out to steady himself against a wall, and the stone shifted under his hand imperceptibly, enough that he stumbled as though the floor had betrayed him. Hallways mirrored themselves in impossible symmetry. A left turn became a right. A door became a wall. A corridor opened into an identical passage he had just traversed. He tried to rely on memory, but each memory was intercepted by the crypt's subtle manipulations, moments folding into one another, creating déjà vu that was not just unsettling but visceral, as if the past itself were pressing against him. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, sometimes forming shapes he could almost name, sometimes simply stretching long and thin like claws reaching for him, disappearing when he tried to focus. The corridor seemed infinite, yet claustrophobic, pressing in on him while simultaneously offering endless expanse, and every attempt to turn back was met with the same impossible geometry. That looped him deeper, drawing him toward areas he had not yet explored, but somehow remembered. The whispers were no longer separate from his thoughts. They threaded in and out, overlapping, repeating, hinting at actions he had not yet taken, people he had not yet encountered, and fears he had never consciously acknowledged. A fleeting glimpse of candlelight flickered somewhere ahead, revealing a vault he did not recall entering, yet it radiated familiarity, a small anchor in the otherwise unmoored space. The crypts were reshaping themselves around his psyche, creating corridors that mirrored memory, regret, and guilt, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had buried, using every whisper, shadow, and shifting wall to break down certainty and tether him further to the labyrinth. And as he moved forward, exhausted, disoriented, and unnervingly aware that the crypts were aware of him, he realized that every step deeper was a step toward a reality that no longer obeyed the rules of time or space, a place where escape might already be impossible, and where the corridors themselves remembered him more than he remembered them. With each step, the investigator felt the weight of time bending around him, slipping through his fingers in ways he could neither measure nor comprehend. The corridors of the crypt had become a fluid labyrinth, twisting and folding, walls stretching upward, then downward, ceiling heights fluctuating like breathing architecture. He paused to examine a carved stone marker and realized his hands were trembling in a way they had not before, joints aching as if decades of wear had settled into minutes. The air pressed in with a heavy chill, damp and metallic, carrying faint whispers that spoke not only of memories, but of hours that had been stolen from him, fragments of time he could not place. Every turn into a new hall brought subtle changes. Shadows elongated unnaturally, inscriptions shifted, and doors that should have led back now opened into corridors that seemed endlessly new. He counted steps, trying to anchor himself, but the numbers meant nothing. Each repetition, each echo of footfall felt longer, slower, as though the crypts themselves had slowed the world outside, consuming his perception of time while accelerating the decay of his body. The whispers layered atop each other, overlapping with fragments of events he had lived, imagined, or feared, confusing past and present, until both seemed irrelevant. Candlelight flickered in distant vaults, revealing photographs of people who were not yet dead, letters folded with care, but dated in the future, and artifacts that seemed to pulse with a temporal energy that made the skin on his arms crawl. He tried to retrace his steps, but each hallway he turned down stretched further than it should have, looping back on itself, bending, twisting, drawing him deeper. His reflection appeared in polished stone now and then, gaunt and aged far beyond the years he remembered. Eyes, hollow, hair streaked with gray that had not been there moments before. Or had it been hours, days? He could no longer tell. The crypt's very existence seemed to feed on the passage of time, consuming increments of life and memory, distorting the continuity of reality. The farther he walked, the more intense the whispers became, layering names, dates, confessions, and premonitions over one another in a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm his mind entirely. Each breath seemed to stretch, each heartbeat echoing across invisible chambers that were forming just beyond his perception. Even the air had weight, pressing down on him as if the crypts were squeezing the hours from his bones. As he stumbled through another hallway, he glimpsed vaults appearing and disappearing in the periphery, each containing artifacts that aged him further, subtly, with every passing second. A photograph of himself appeared, older than he was, writing notes he had not yet composed, smiling faintly as if aware of the inevitability of what awaited him. He understood then that the crypts were not merely spaces of stone and shadow. They were entities capable of manipulating the very fabric of existence, bending space, distorting time, and consuming all who ventured too deeply. Every corridor, every vault, every whispered syllable conspired to draw him further into a labyrinth where age and reality had no meaning, where the world above might continue unaware while below. He was already becoming a fragment of the crypts themselves, trapped in a time loop that had no beginning and no end, leaving him unmoored, unrecognizable even to himself, and entirely at the mercy of the living, breathing stone around him. He reached a chamber unlike any he had passed before, the walls impossibly smooth, polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected not only the stone around him, but himself, though not quite as he knew himself. The figure staring back from the glassy surface had hollow eyes, cheeks sunken, and hands gnarled with age he did not yet feel. It moved with a deliberate calm, writing in a notebook that he did not remember ever bringing with him, scribbling words and diagrams that seemed to pulse with significance beyond comprehension. For a moment, he thought it was merely a reflection, but the figure's awareness was palpable, its gaze tracking him with a patience that felt ancient, and it smiled faintly, knowing he had arrived exactly where the crypts intended. Whispers had swelled into a relentless cacophony, layered voices overlapping, repeating, fragmenting, each syllable threading directly into his thoughts, recounting memories he had tried to bury and fears he had not yet confronted. The polished walls reflected not only him, but the corridors behind him, endless and impossible, looping back on themselves with new anomalies at every turn. Vaults that should have been empty now contained artifacts, photographs, and letters with dates he had not yet lived, their presence both impossible and undeniable. Every attempt to move, to step away from the reflection, was thwarted. The floor shifted subtly, corridors folded and stretched, and time seemed to bend, each second elongating into hours, each breath stretching thin in the cold, damp air. The hollow-eyed version of himself continued writing, patient and unhurried, yet in its stillness lay an implicit command. Observation was no longer enough. He was already part of the crypt's design, a participant in a cycle older than the stone itself. Whispers converged into a singular rhythm, voices overlapping to form accusations, names, instructions, all layered with a precision that suggested consciousness, the crypts themselves aware of his presence and intentions. Panic clawed at his chest, but rational thought faltered under the weight of the impossible reality. The crypts had not only ensnared his body, but had begun to entangle his mind, blending memory, perception, and anticipation into a single, disorienting experience. He reached for the notebook, compelled to write, to interact, but as soon as his fingers brushed the surface, the chamber shifted. Walls elongated, vaults shimmered in the periphery, and the reflection mirrored not his movements, but a version of him that already knew every choice he had yet to make. A metallic tang rose in the air, mingling with the damp scent of stone, and the whispers intensified, as if mocking the futility of resistance. The realization settled like ice in his chest. He was no longer an intruder exploring the crypts. He had become an element of them, a reflection and conduit of their memory and intent. Every corridor he had traversed, every vault that had vanished or appeared, had led inexorably to this chamber. And now the crypts held him fully in their shifting architecture. He could step forward, back, or sideways, but each motion only deepened his entanglement. Every decision a rehearsal pre-written by the crypts. In that polished, infinite chamber, with the hollow-eyed version of himself patiently writing what he had not yet thought to write, he understood the inevitability. He was trapped, observed, and integrated into a living labyrinth, aware of himself, yet no longer free to leave, a participant in the crypt's endless, echoing memory. Every step he took led nowhere, the corridors folding and stretching around him with a deliberate, malevolent logic that denied comprehension. Vaults appeared in fleeting glimpses, only to vanish the moment he focused, leaving empty halls where he had expected solid stone. The air was thick, heavy with damp and a metallic tang that clawed at his throat, carrying whispers that no longer hinted. They commanded, layering over one another in a chaotic chorus that rattled his mind and stitched together fragments of memory, premonition, and fear. Time had become meaningless. Seconds stretched into hours, hours into unknowable stretches, and yet the crypts pressed on, reshaping around him, feeding on each heartbeat and each faltering breath. His limbs ached as if years had passed in the span of minutes. His reflection in polished stone now warped and hollow-eyed, a stranger whose eyes mirrored his own panic and despair. Every attempted exit collapsed before him. Doorways shifted into walls, corridors looped infinitely, and familiar landmarks transformed into alien geometry, a labyrinth designed to consume his sense of self. The whispers had multiplied beyond recognition, overlapping in layers so thick he could no longer tell which thoughts were his and which were the crypts speaking through him, urging confession, acknowledgement, submission. He stumbled forward, hands brushing cold stone, lantern flickering, shadows twisting into shapes that resembled faces from his past. Friends, strangers, memories, each one frozen in expressions of judgment or mockery, then vanishing before he could hold them in focus. The crypts seemed aware of every move, every hesitation, every attempt to cling to reality, bending the very fabric of space around him until the distinction between corridor and chamber, past and future, self and reflection blurred entirely. He realized with a hollow certainty that he was trapped not merely in stone and shadow, but in a dimension governed by the crypt's own will, a liminal place where reality above could continue untouched while below he became a ghost in a living labyrinth. The mirrors that appeared sporadically reflected versions of himself that were older, younger, twisted in ways that made him question the continuity of his own existence. Some wrote, some watched silently, some whispered back at him, feeding fragments of their own thoughts into his mind. A sudden, oppressive silence would descend, broken only by the distant, impossible sound of footsteps echoing in directions he could not trace, followed by the whispers resuming in a crescendo, layering accusation, revelation, and promise in one inescapable torrent. Every instinct screamed to flee, to find some tangible exit, but the crypts denied escape, looping him endlessly, feeding on his awareness, his fear, and his hope. Even as he tried to anchor himself to the faint memory of the world above, he felt himself dissolving into the labyrinth's architecture, a living element of its endless, shifting memory. Above the cemetery, dawn broke unnoticed, birds sang, wind drifted across gravestones, and yet below he remained, suspended between reality and the crypt's dimension, time stretching and folding, corridors repeating infinitely, echoes of his own presence fading into whispers, until the cycle itself became the only constant. The crypts had claimed him fully, leaving nothing but a faint, lingering awareness that he had once existed, a warning and invitation for the next curious visitor to step beneath the stones and vanish into the same relentless, open-ended horror. I arrived at the ridge as the sun began its slow descent, spilling molten gold across the valley. The air was thin and smelled faintly of pine and stone, crisp against my lungs, as I carried my pack toward the flat ground near the cemetery. From up here, the valley stretched endlessly, cliffs dropping sharply into shadowed hollows, the distant river a silver ribbon reflecting the dying light. I thought I had chosen solitude, a place to watch the sunset and set up camp without interruption. As I stepped closer to the cemetery gates, I noticed something odd about the sound. Each footfall echoed not from the cliffs below, not from the distant trees, but from the gravestones themselves. The clicks of my boots bounced back, distorted, lingering longer than they should, as though the earth had been hollowed beneath the markers. My stomach tightened. I tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue or the unusual topography, but even the rustle of the wind through dead leaves carried a strange resonance, a subtle mimicry of human voices just at the edge of hearing. The cemetery was small, tucked onto a ledge above the valley, rows of weathered stones leaning under decades of neglect. Some were cracked, others choked by overgrown weeds. The markers closest to the gate bore familiar inscriptions, names and dates fading into illegibility. But one grave caught my eye immediately, a fresh mound, the soil dark and uncompacted yet untouched by footprints. Its marker was stark against the dying light, simple and unmarked, yet it drew my gaze like a magnet. I paused at its edge, feeling the cool bite of the earth beneath my fingers as I brushed at the surface. The smell of turned soil was sharp, earthy, carrying something else. Something almost metallic, the faint hint of blood or decay that didn't belong here. I shook my head, forcing myself to continue with routine. I set down my pack, pulling out my tent and staking it firmly into the rocky soil. The sunset deepened, casting long shadows that stretched across the cemetery like fingers pointing at me, accusing or inviting. I could not tell. I noticed the air had grown unnaturally still, heavier than it should have been at this altitude. No breeze stirred the dry leaves. No birds sang. The valley below seemed to hold its breath, waiting. As I unpacked my stove and laid out supplies, I glanced repeatedly at the fresh grave. With every passing minute, it seemed more deliberate, more out of place, as though someone, or something, had prepared it for me to see. The surrounding stones appeared to shift in subtle ways, small tilts or rotations I might have imagined in daylight, but now seemed purposeful. The longer I stared, the more I sensed the weight of unseen eyes, something watching from the dark corners where shadows pooled thickest. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced them steady, insisting to myself this was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Night settled quickly in the mountains, faster than I expected. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only a bruised indigo sky. Stars began to prick through the darkness, pale and cold. I could hear the occasional snap of a distant branch, the faint rustle of wildlife, yet every ordinary sound seemed warped, exaggerated, and eerily timed. Footfalls that weren't mine echoed faintly again among the graves, and I caught the unmistakable impression of movement at the edges of my vision. A shadow shifted behind a leaning tombstone. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. Only the fresh grave remained steadfast and still, unclaimed yet utterly present. I lit a small lantern beside my tent, its warm glow a fragile barrier against the dark that pressed from every side. As I crouched to check my gear, I felt the first real pang of unease. The valley was beautiful, yes, breathtaking even, but it carried a weight that felt predatory. This place had been waiting, not for me specifically perhaps, but for someone to notice. Someone to walk too close to what had been buried. Someone to hear the valley echo in ways that didn't belong. I could feel it, the quiet insistence of the cemetery itself, patient and aware. I lay down in the tent with the lantern at my side, staring at the outline of the fresh grave beyond the mesh. The night deepened, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and I realized sleep might not come easily. Something was here, and it had begun to mark my presence. The valley didn't just echo, it watched, and it remembered. As the sun sank behind the jagged ridges, spilling molten shadows across the valley, I watched the light fade and felt the first real weight of night settle over the cemetery. The stones, once pale and weathered in the dying glow, now loomed like silent sentinels, their cracks and chips forming grim, almost familiar faces in the gloom. I moved cautiously, feet crunching over loose soil and pebbles, aware of every sound. But it wasn't my footsteps that unsettled me. It was the valley itself, carrying something I could not name, shaping the echoes of wind and rock into soft, indistinct sobbing. Then I saw it. A figure kneeling at the fresh grave. I froze, stomach tightening. The person, or whatever it was, rocked gently back and forth, arms resting lightly on bent knees, head bowed. At first, I thought it must be another hiker, a mourner who had found the same strange grave I had, but the wind carried no whisper of breath, no rustle of clothing. and yet I could hear sobs, soft, almost imperceptible, threading through the air as if rising from the ground itself. The sound moved independently of the figure, shifting in a slow, deliberate circle around me. My heart thudded, the rhythm louder than the quiet sobbing, and every instinct I had screamed to keep a distance. But curiosity rooted me in place. I adjusted the strap of my pack and reached for my camera, fumbling briefly as the shadows deepened. The kneeling figure did not lift its head. It remained utterly still, a human shape that moved only in the gentle rocking. I squinted, trying to discern details. Was it clothed in a jacket, a coat, or some other material my mind refused to name? The folds and creases merged with the darkness, rendering it less a person than a silhouette conjured by the valley's unnatural acoustics. I tried calling out, my voice cutting across the stones, but it was swallowed immediately. The sobbing seemed to answer my words, rising in volume and then fading, circling around me as though I were the one being observed, not the other way around. The ground beneath the figure's knees was freshly turned, darker than the surrounding soil, yet it bore no footprints beyond my own, no disturbances that might indicate someone had recently arrived. I took a cautious step closer, eyes fixed on the shape. Each movement made the shadows stretch in impossible ways, elongating fingers of darkness that seemed to reach for me, brushing against my forearms and ankles. I could feel the air grow heavier with each breath, as if the night itself pressed in, aware and deliberate. The faint metallic scent of damp earth mingled with a sweetness I could not place, flowers, perhaps, or decay, and it set my senses on edge. The figure rocked more insistently now, and I realized it wasn't reacting to the wind. There was a rhythm to its movement, deliberate and unnerving. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't look away. Something about the way it bent and swayed, unblinking and silent, felt wrong in a way that prickled my spine, like watching a memory replay itself in slow motion, frozen in grief that had no owner. And then I noticed the impossibility. The kneeling shape had not shifted at all from the moment I first saw it, yet the sobbing had moved, echoing from a dozen directions at once, circling the stones, rising from the soil beneath my boots. I stepped backward, careful not to stumble, but the shadows seemed to swell to fill the space I vacated. Rocks and roots underfoot twisted my footing, and every glance over my shoulder made the figure appear closer than before, or perhaps it was I who was moving into its domain. My camera trembled in my hands, a fragile shield, as I raised it and captured a frame. The display glitched slightly, the screen flickering, showing a faint amber glow around the kneeling figure that didn't exist in reality. My fingers shook as I tried to steady it. The sobbing surged suddenly, louder, then fell silent. I blinked, and the figure remained kneeling, impossibly still, even as the valley grew darker and the moon began to rise, pale and slivered. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that no one else was up here. The path I had taken, the ridge I had descended from, all was empty and silent beyond the cemetery gates. The wind carried nothing but the cemetery's strange chorus of echoes, moving as though the graves themselves were rehearsing mourning, teaching me how to listen. The kneeling figure did not acknowledge my presence, did not react to the cold that had crept into my bones. Yet every instinct told me it had noticed me, had chosen me to witness it, as if the valley had conspired to lead my eyes to this impossible scene. I remained rooted, unable to approach yet unwilling to turn away. Shadows shifted across the stones, stretching unnaturally, elongating like fingers of darkness that traced paths I could not follow. The sobbing continued, now seeming to pulse in time with my heartbeat, a slow and rhythmic reminder that I was alone here, but not unobserved. I swallowed, feeling the taste of fear sharp on my tongue, the night pressing in with its thick, unyielding silence. And then the last light of dusk vanished entirely, leaving only the kneeling figure, the fresh grave, and the valley's unnatural echo of soft, endless sobs, teaching me that some presence does not need to move to be alive. Curiosity propelled me forward despite every instinct urging me to retreat. The kneeling figure remained at the fresh grave, its movements eerily slow and deliberate, but I could no longer look away. Each step toward it made the valley around me feel denser, the shadows thicker, folding in on themselves as though the earth itself were breathing. The soft sobbing circled in the wind again, now a deliberate rhythm, pulling my attention in every direction at once, disorienting me. I reached the grave and knelt beside it, noting the soil was dark and freshly turned. Yet there was something impossible about it. No footprints approached it beyond my own, no signs of human labor other than the disturbed earth itself. I brushed my fingers lightly over the mound, the soil crumbling with a damp, metallic scent that made my stomach twist. My eyes went to the marker, or rather the absence of one. Blank, uninscribed, untouched by time. There were no names, no dates, nothing to anchor it to reality. It was as though the grave existed purely to be observed, a deliberate void, waiting. The air shifted then, subtle at first, a cooling draft that moved against the grain of the wind. My hair lifted at the nape of my neck. The sobbing, now louder, seemed to circle closer, tracing the edge of the stones, threading around my feet, brushing against my ears with uncanny precision. The valley's echo no longer reflected natural sound. It carried intention, a strange awareness, choosing where the grief would fall. My pulse quickened. I took a half step back, and the figure rose. Not gradually, but as though it had always been standing, and my perception had simply caught up. It drifted toward me with that same measured rhythm, posture rigid yet fluid, knees bent slightly, shoulders bowed. I froze. The moonlight caught a faint shimmer along its edges, not fabric, not skin, but something else, something intangible that made it both present and impossible. I could not discern details. There were no features, only the shape and the subtle movements that suggested consciousness. The figure's proximity did not make a sound, yet the sobbing grew louder, vibrating in the air in my chest, as though the sound had been anchored to me rather than to it. I scanned the surrounding graves. Shadows stretched and warped unnaturally, elongating across the rocks in ways that defied the angle of the moon. Some stones seemed to have shifted slightly, their alignment subtly altered from the night before. The cemetery was no longer static, it was responding, rearranging itself around the presence, around me. Each footstep I took felt heavier than it should, every breath measured in sync with the valley's unnatural rhythm. I realized I could not retreat in a straight line. Every path I attempted became confusing, looping, twisting in ways that contradicted memory. Then the sobbing changed. It no longer seemed distant or hollow. It carried nuances I could not place. Tiny variations, almost like whispered syllables, curled into the air. I bent closer to the grave, listening, and felt an unnatural recognition, as though the valley itself were trying to speak to me, testing me, teaching me the cadence of grief it had learned over decades of silence. My camera, which I had raised instinctively, began to glitch slightly. The display flickered, capturing faint ghostly outlines of figures crouched behind nearby stones. None of these apparitions were present in the darkness in front of me. They only existed through the lens, in the distorted reflection of reality that the camera now revealed. A gust of wind spiraled around me suddenly, carrying the sobbing in a full circle, making it impossible to tell where it originated. The figure paused for a heartbeat, then continued its measured drift, never blinking, never acknowledging my presence beyond the weight of intent that radiated from it. My instincts screamed to leave, to climb back to the ridge and flee from the valley, but my legs refused to obey. The blank grave demanded attention, demanded that I watch, that I recognize it for what it was. A threshold, a marker not for the dead, but for the living who were unprepared for what might be observed in silence. I glanced at the other stones again. Shadows shifted, aligning in patterns that my mind tried and failed to rationalize. The wind carried the soft, incessant sobbing, now punctuated by faint clicks and scrapes, like fingernails against stone. My fingers tightened on the camera strap, knuckles white. Every instinct told me I was no longer alone, yet there was no evidence beyond the figure and the ever-changing sounds around me. The valley had become a participant, the mourners invisible, their lessons unspoken, and the grave itself a silent teacher. I took another step back, and the figure stopped. It hovered there, unblinking, unyielding. I could feel its presence in the soil beneath my boots, in the air that pressed against my chest, in the valley that refused to echo naturally. And then, in a blink, the figure vanished, leaving the fresh grave alone again. But the sobbing continued, now louder and more insistent, circling me, drawing me inward, reminding me that the cemetery was no longer just a place. It was a force, a sentient space with patience and memory. I stood frozen, the camera trembling in my hands, realizing that I had crossed a line. This was no longer curiosity or exploration. I had stepped into a realm where the dead, or whatever lingered among them, dictated the rules. The grave had no name, but it had chosen to make me notice, to watch, to understand. And in that silence, I understood that the valley would not let me leave unchanged. The next night, I returned to the cemetery, compelled by a mixture of fear and a need for answers I didn't fully understand. The ridge was darker than before, the valley swallowed in shadow, and the first chill of night pressed down on my shoulders like stone. My tent, left behind in my haste the previous morning, lay folded at the edge of the clearing, undisturbed, as if no one had touched it. Yet I felt watched even before I set foot among the graves. The air smelled damp and metallic, heavier than the wind should have allowed, carrying that faint trace of earth turned by hands unseen. I moved cautiously toward the familiar mound, the fresh grave that had marked the beginning of this descent into the unnatural. And there it was, the figure, kneeling exactly where I had left it in my memory, rocking slowly, rhythmically, as though the earth itself was conducting the motion. Only now I noticed subtle changes. Shadows clustered more densely around it, pooling unnaturally at the corners of the stones. The sobbing rose in pitch and cadence, echoing from angles that defied logic, circling my position in an almost sentient pattern. I raised my camera instinctively, and the display immediately began to distort, ghostly shapes flickering at the edges of the screen. Something was waiting for me, rehearsing grief like a ritual, as though aware of my every step. I stepped closer, measuring my movements carefully, and the figure responded, not with sound, not with a blink, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. One knee lifted, then the other, rising gradually until the form hovered upright, taller than I expected, its silhouette stretching into the night. For a heartbeat, I thought it might simply vanish, dissolve back into the shadows, but it did not. It moved toward me with deliberate patience, the air around it thickening, bending sound and scent in ways my mind could barely comprehend. Each step seemed to tug at the valley itself, stirring leaves, coaxing whispers from stones, shaping the echoes into faint imitations of voices I knew from memory but could not place. Panic, rational and irrational, swelled in my chest, yet my feet remained rooted. The figure's slow drift was mesmerizing, a hypnotic cadence of knees, shoulders, and bowed head. It carried an impossible weight. Presence, without substance, intent without physical form. Shadows cast by the moon twisted beneath it, spreading in radial patterns, merging with the darkness around other stones that seemed to tilt and shift subtly in response. The sobbing intensified, circling, rising, now layered with high, almost human-like wails that did not belong to any body I could see. I realized with mounting dread that I was not approaching it. It was drawing me in, the valley acting as conduit. I tried to back away, but each retreating step seemed to loop me in closer, the ground beneath my boots reshaping in ways that made direction meaningless. The figure did not hurry, did not pause, yet in the blink of an eye it seemed nearer, as though it had anticipated my hesitation and closed the distance with some quiet inevitability. I caught movement at the corners of my vision, other silhouettes flickering briefly behind tombstones. But whenever I turned, nothing remained. Only the central figure moved, a rhythm of grief rehearsed endlessly. The valley carried sound in ways that no longer obeyed natural laws. My own breathing returned as echoes, slowed and warped, overlaying the sobbing of the unseen mourners. I felt a tug in my chest, a compulsion to kneel, to mirror the figure's posture as though submission could grant me clarity or mercy. But my mind screamed against it. The air grew colder, a sharp edge that bit at exposed skin, carrying with it the faint metallic smell I had noticed the first night, mixed with something older, earthier, unplaceable yet deeply familiar, like the scent of freshly turned soil in the ruins of memory. Then, as I froze in place, I blinked and the figure vanished. Not a step, not a pause, just empty air where the silhouette had been. Yet the shadows remained, elongated and twitching unnaturally, and the sobbing persisted, circling me in irregular patterns. My heart pounded so loudly that I could feel it in my ears, and the valley itself seemed to hum, carrying a resonance that I knew I had never heard before. I stumbled back to my tent, tripping over roots and uneven stones, the faint flicker of moonlight catching the contours of other graves that seemed subtly rearranged from the previous night. I dared not look over my shoulder, yet a part of me knew I would never truly leave this place. The mourner had not moved in space alone. It had moved in intent, embedding itself into the very valley, teaching the echoes to follow. I collapsed against the tent, gasping, listening to the sobbing that continued beyond the fabric walls. The air felt alive, charged with patience, aware of every twitch, every blink, every thought. I realized then that the mourner's movement was not just motion. It was a shift in the rules of the world around me, a recalibration of what the valley considered possible. It did not run, it did not chase, it guided, it tested, it owned, and I understood with sick clarity that I had become part of its design. Night deepened, shadows pooling in impossible angles, and the sobbing carried the memory of the valley's countless unseen witnesses. The kneeling figure had moved, yes, but it had moved in ways I could not map, could not rationalize, and in doing so it had claimed a part of my attention, my awareness, my reality. I could not tell where it ended and the cemetery began, and for the first time, I understood the valley had a consciousness, and it was patient. I did not sleep that night. Every faint rustle, every whisper of air through the tombstones reminded me of the mourner's presence, teaching me that distance and time mattered little here. The figure had moved, but I somehow had stayed exactly where it wanted me, trapped between curiosity and terror, between the reality I knew and the shadowed truths that the valley held. I returned the following night, compelled by a mix of dread and obsession I couldn't explain. The valley had settled into a deep, unnatural quiet, the wind whispering through the pines in uneven rhythms. Shadows pooled along the stones, black and viscous, stretching impossibly long under the thin silver light of the moon. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, curling into my lungs with a sharp edge that made each breath a conscious act. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself I was here to observe, to document, but as soon as I stepped into the cemetery, I knew it was already waiting. The fresh grave from the night before stood untouched, yet the figure was nowhere in sight. Then I saw it, closer than I expected, its silhouette at a small, unnamed mound just a few yards from where I stood. Its posture was identical to the first night. Kneeling, rocking gently back and forth, head bowed. The sobbing returned, faint at first, almost respectful, then swelling around me in layers, as though the valley itself was breathing the sound through the stones. I realized with a chill that the sobs were no longer tethered to the figure. They radiated from beneath the soil, from graves I hadn't noticed before, circling me in a slow, precise pattern that made it impossible to tell where they originated. I raised my camera instinctively, and the viewfinder froze for a moment, then flickered with an unsettling clarity. Faces appeared etched into the nearby stones, not carved, not painted. Living faces, their eyes wide, following me. Some seemed familiar, distorted in ways I couldn't place, others entirely alien, yet all held the same silent grief. The lantern from the first night, the faint glow I had glimpsed before, appeared again in the distance, hovering just behind the kneeling figure. It pulsed softly, not as light but as a presence, as if guiding my perception, showing me a path I didn't want to follow. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and noticed the figure's shadow stretching unnaturally toward me. It defied the moon, growing longer, folding over the graves and my boots, reaching, probing, claiming space that belonged only to me. My breath came in short gasps, but the air felt heavy, as though inhaling had become a negotiation with something alive beneath the stones. Every instinct screamed to run, yet my feet were slow, weighted, as if the valley itself had decided the pace. The graves around me seemed to shift imperceptibly, rearranging in ways that made the layout unfamiliar. Stone markers twisted on axes that should have been impossible, forming labyrinthine passages through the cemetery that led me directly toward the figure. I tried to step back, to find the path I had taken the night before, but every route spiraled inward, folding into itself, looping me closer to the kneeling presence. The sobbing intensified, now layered with whispers, familiar phrases from childhood, secrets I had never spoken aloud. Echoes of my own fears returned in tones I could barely recognize. The figure didn't move toward me in a conventional sense. It stayed kneeling, yet the shadows around it reached and twisted, a living network connecting it to the graves, to the lantern, to the earth beneath my feet. I realized then that distance didn't matter. It could approach without moving, and I could feel the pull in my chest, a magnetic tug urging me to my knees, to mimic the posture, to join the silent congregation of the lost. Panic surged, raw and unfiltered, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. A sudden gust of wind spiraled through the stones, carrying the sobs in a tight circle that seemed to close in around me. The lantern flickered, once, twice, then drifted slightly forward, just enough to mark a path deeper into the cemetery, along graves that had not been there the previous night. I realized the mourner's closeness was intentional, the placement deliberate. Every step I might take to escape only guided me further into the valley's design, deeper into its secrets. I tried calling out, but my voice returned warped, layered with other tones I didn't recognize. Fragments of conversations I had never had, whispered warnings, pleas, names I didn't know. The valley had learned me, cataloged my presence, and responded in kind. The figure's shadow reached even closer now, stretching across the new graves, over my boots, toward my chest. Each inhale seemed to pull me into its orbit, every exhale stolen by the cold, thick air. When I finally broke free, stumbling backward, the figure remained kneeling, utterly still, but impossibly closer than the night before. I realized then that this was not pursuit, it was inevitability. No matter how far I retreated, the figure would be waiting, closer each night, teaching the valley's rules, reshaping the cemetery around me. Every step, every blink, every thought had already been anticipated. I left the cemetery that night, shaken, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The lantern's glow lingered in the corners of my vision, even as I walked into the woods, even as the valley's shadows faded behind me. I understood then, with icy clarity, that proximity had changed nothing. The Mourner had learned my pace, my patterns, and the valley had adapted. It was patient, it was waiting. And when I returned, it would be closer still, its presence inescapable, its lessons relentless. By the sixth night, I no longer questioned why I returned. The valley had claimed me, its shadows entwined with my thoughts, and each step toward the cemetery felt like a surrender I could neither resist nor understand. The sun had disappeared hours ago, leaving a sky smeared with bruised clouds, and the first whispers of wind carried the scent of damp stone and decomposing foliage. My pack was heavier with equipment I barely touched. Camera, notebook, tape recorder, but it felt necessary, like talismans against a presence I was already too close to comprehend. The fresh graves waited, as if arranged for me alone, and the kneeling figure appeared almost immediately, closer than ever, positioned now at a grave I hadn't noticed on previous nights. The soil looked freshly turned, dark and loose, and faint boot imprints that mirrored my own were pressed into its surface. The figure's head remained bowed, rocking subtly, but the sobs no longer seemed bound to the figure itself. They emanated from the valley, rising from the ground beneath me, echoing through the stones, curling into my ears and embedding themselves into my chest. When I raised my camera, the viewfinder wavered and shook as though recording through layers of water, revealing fragments of faces stitched into the nearby markers, eyes impossibly alive and fixed upon me. I spoke aloud, calling out the figure's name, or at least a name I assigned to it, desperate to confirm my own existence in this place. The words returned, not as my own, but twisted and layered, my voice overlaid with whispers I had never heard, uttering my own secrets in tones I couldn't recognize. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The valley had learned me. It knew the shape of my fears, the cadence of my steps, the echo of my own syllables, and it answered with those fragments, pressing them against my mind like an invisible hand. The kneeling figure rose slowly this time, inch by inch, until it hovered upright, taller, somehow more defined in the moonlight. The shadows it cast stretched unnaturally, folding across graves that had shifted overnight. The lantern appeared again, floating beside it, pulsing faintly as though inhaling my attention, beckoning me to move further into the cemetery's heart. Each step I took caused the stones to shift beneath my feet, subtly rearranging the paths, forming corridors I could not map, loops I could not break. The air itself felt alive, pressing and pulling in directions that should not have existed, disorienting me. I attempted to call someone, anyone, on my phone. Dial tones sang briefly, then dissolved into faint crying and distant sobs that I had not heard in this world before. The sound bounced, warped, returned to me as if the valley had claimed my connection to the outside, translating my own desperation into echoes of grief. The figure's shadow reached forward, flowing over my boots, moving across the ground faster than its form should have allowed. Panic rose, a wave I could not fight, and I realized that this presence did not pursue. It measured, it waited, it rehearsed patience far beyond any human sense of time. I tried stepping backward, tracing my own steps from previous nights, but each path twisted subtly, folding in on itself, confusing orientation. The new grave at which the mourner now knelt seemed to appear spontaneously. Soil dark and loose, faint impressions of my own boots pressed into it, as if I had already walked this path before. The sobs rose again, circling my head, circling the grave, forming a tight rhythm that pulled me closer, despite every effort to resist. Every whispered tone seemed to know my name now, revealing secrets I had never spoken aloud, lifting memories I had buried long ago. The lantern floated closer, guiding me along a narrow corridor of tombstones I did not recognize, graves that seemed to have grown overnight. Each flicker of its glow revealed faces etched into stone, some familiar, some unplaceable, all watching, all aware. I realized that the mourner's presence was no longer external. It was embedded in the valley itself, in the air, in the shadows, in the folds of perception, bending the cemetery around my consciousness. I was being taught, measured, tested, and I had no choice but to participate. When I finally stumbled back to my tent, exhausted, I discovered the whispering continued. My own voice, fractured and layered with others, repeated over and over, the valley echoing my secrets back to me in cycles I could not escape. The figure had not left, nor had the lantern vanished. They remained in the periphery, the cemetery shaping itself to prolong observation, to enforce proximity. I understood then that distance had no meaning here. No matter how far I fled, no matter how long I stayed away, the valley had learned my cadence, my presence, my name. It had woven me into its ritual. I did not sleep that night. Every rustle of leaves, every sigh of the wind, every shifting shadow reminded me of the presence that now knew everything I had ever held in silence. The mourner waited, the graves watched, and the valley whispered my own name back to me, each syllable a tether I could not sever. I never expected to return for a seventh night, yet some force, whether curiosity or compulsion, drew me back. The valley waited in the same bruised twilight as before, mist curling low over the stones, heavy with the scent of earth and frost. My tent was pitched on a slight rise, where I thought I could keep watch over the cemetery without being swallowed by it. But as darkness deepened, I felt the familiar pull, the same sensation that had guided my steps closer and closer each night. The air shifted abruptly, colder now, carrying a metallic tang that clung to my skin. I tried to convince myself I was imagining movement, that the rocking figure kneeling over the fresh grave was a trick of shadow and moonlight. But then I saw it. Inside my tent, tall and unmoving, a presence that did not belong there. The canvas walls fluttered faintly around it, responding to no wind, as if the figure's awareness had warped the space itself. Its head remained bowed, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, the scrutiny of a being that knew my every thought, every memory I had hoped to hide. I froze, breath caught in my chest, as a cold, earthy smell, like freshly dug soil, flooded the small space. The figure knelt inches from my sleeping bag, and though I could not see a face, I could sense eyes focused on me. Whispered words leaked from its presence, syllables that mirrored my own secrets, fragments of my past I had never told another soul. My fingers trembled as I reached for the camera, but it felt distant, inert, as though the valley itself had taken control of perception. Outside the tent, the wind rose, carrying faint sobs that circled in slow, deliberate arcs. I realized then that the mourners I had glimpsed on previous nights were no longer confined to graves. They had moved into every shadow, every corner of the valley, invisible yet audible, circling in patterns that made even the ground beneath my tent seem unfamiliar. The seventh night had erased the boundary between observer and observed. I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the valley's ritual, a note in its endless lament. I tried to speak, to call out, but the words returned warped, layered with echoes of my own fears and memories. It was as if the figure had not only learned my voice, it had taken it and bent it into something I did not recognize. Panic rose, raw and viscous, yet I could not move. My body had become a part of the space, tethered by the valley's awareness. The figure leaned closer, still kneeling, whispering secrets I had never dared speak aloud, weaving my own confessions into the silent air. The tent walls quivered again, responding not to wind but to the figure's presence. Every shadow within seemed to stretch, elongating into shapes that were not entirely human, all of them directed toward me, pressing, measuring, waiting. The lantern's glow from previous nights appeared faintly in the corner of my vision, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, drawing me deeper into the valley's rhythm. I could not escape. Every attempt to turn, to flee, to even think of leaving, was met with the same oppressive weight of anticipation. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in a distorted haze. The figure whispered, the sobs outside crescendoed, and I felt the valley's patience like a tangible pressure against my chest. It was teaching me, testing me, folding my own presence into its labyrinthine rules. Every movement I had made in the last 6 nights, every step I had taken, had been catalogued, rehearsed, and now I existed entirely within its control. When dawn finally approached, the figure retreated, rising from its kneeling position yet not disappearing entirely. The tent flaps shifted back into place as if it had never been there, and the valley fell into a tentative silence. I stumbled out into the weak light, shaking, the earth still cold beneath my boots. I did not pause, I did not look back, but even as I ran down the slope, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the resonance of whispered secrets following me. My pack remained half unpacked, my camera still inoperable, yet every image I had taken over the previous nights pulsed in my mind. Faces etched into tombstones, eyes that had followed me, shadows that defied logic. They were imprinted on my perception, impossible to erase. The valley had claimed a piece of me, leaving me changed, tethered, and haunted. Even as the sun rose over the distant peaks, bathing the cemetery in golden light, I knew that the mourner would return at midnight, kneeling silently over new graves. And I understood with a cold certainty that the valley had learned my name, my presence, and my limits. It was patient, it was eternal, and the lessons it had begun that night would follow me far beyond the mountain slopes. Weeks had passed since I fled the valley, but the memory of that 7th night clung to me like a second skin. My tent, my camera, my notes. I had left them all behind, yet each morning I woke to the same oppressive weight in my chest, the lingering chill of unseen eyes tracking me. I told myself I was safe now, miles away from the mountain cemetery, yet the valley had a persistence I could not shake. It had learned me, memorized the cadence of my steps, the secrets I had spoken aloud, and I realized that no distance could sever the tether it had woven. Locals began to speak in hushed tones about a figure drifting silently among the graves at midnight, always kneeling, always waiting. They did not describe a person. They described a presence, a shadow that moved with purpose yet no urgency, its shape preserved across the shifting landscape. The unnamed grave, the one that had first drawn my attention, was now undisturbed, as if time had folded around it and preserved it in a state of eternal quiet. A new grave had appeared beside it, freshly turned, signaling that the ritual of the valley continued, independent of my observation. I returned once from a distance, unable to resist the pull. The valley looked ordinary in daylight, serene even, but the air carried the faint metallic scent of earth, and the shadows held a subtle tension, as though the landscape itself was waiting for something. The graves were aligned in patterns I did not recognize, some shifting slightly when I blinked, as if aware of my gaze. The lantern's glow appeared in my mind even when it was absent from sight, pulsing faintly, tethering me to the place as if it had followed me across the miles. Each night, in the quiet hours, I felt it, the valley's patient observation, the kneeling presence hovering at the edges of perception. My own memories of the nights I had spent there returned in fragments, the whispered secrets, the weight of unseen eyes, the way the lantern had guided me deeper into the cemetery's heart. I realized that the mourner had not been bound to a single night or a single form. It was a constant, waiting for anyone who might notice, for anyone whose name it could learn, whose presence it could catalog and fold into its endless vigil. My photographs, even after months, still carried the imprint of the valley's influence. Faces etched into tombstones stared from the prints, eyes alive and unblinking, following me even when I had thought the images forgotten. The lantern's glow appeared in every frame, soft yet insistent, a reminder that the secrets of Section 9 had been captured, transferred, and now lived with me. I could delete the files, I could destroy the prints, yet the images persisted in memory and perception, proof that the cemetery's haunting had not been left behind. Sometimes I hear the sobs. They are faint, carried on the wind in a rhythm that echoes the night I first returned to the cemetery, and yet they are unmistakably present in the places I walk now, threading through ordinary streets, through the quiet of my apartment, into the shadows of hotel rooms. I have learned not to call them my own thoughts. They are the valley's lessons, reminders that it has learned my name, my fears, and the limits of my escape. I have not returned in person. I know the valley will wait, undisturbed, preserving its graves and its mourners, ready for the next observer. But the tether is unbroken. My belongings left behind remain exactly as I abandoned them. The tent open to the cold air, the camera resting beside the notebook with pages scribbled in frantic ink. Locals whisper that the valley has a patience measured in decades, in centuries, and that any who notice the mourner will leave part of themselves behind. The valley does not chase, it waits, it catalogs, it learns. And for anyone who comes close, it teaches the same lesson I learned. Presence cannot be hidden. Secrets cannot be buried. And in the heart of the cemetery, someone, or something, is always kneeling, waiting, patient beyond reason, silent beyond words. Even now, at midnight, I feel the echo in my chest. A soft, deliberate sob, a rhythm I recognize, but one that has never belonged to me alone. Somewhere in that valley, in the graves that shift and twist without pattern, the mourner waits, as it always has, as it always will. And I understand finally that the valley's lesson is permanent. The dead are patient, the shadows eternal, and the valley remembers everyone who ever noticed.